Hey, happy Thursday morning, everybody. I'm Matt Scalisi. I'm joined by Ben Flanagan, and this is Bammers, our show where we talk about all things that Alabama fans are thinking about, caring about, wringing their hands over. Specifically, that's what we're talking about today. We want to dig into fan anxieties a little bit, and honestly, not a lot for Alabama fans to be worried about most of the time. It's a relatively worry-free experience being a Bama fan in these times that we live in. But we know that Bama fans do it anyway. We know that despite the fact that you very, very seldom have anything to worry about, you do worry because that's what fans do. And what we're gonna try to sort through today is what we think are, I don't know, Ben, maybe it's judgmental of me to say reasonable, but the games that we think are maybe reasonable for fans to be anxious about and to be worried about when we start to, and this is the time of year where we look ahead, we start looking at the schedule, you're making plans for the fall. And I think you start to look and say, well, which games are actually worth worrying about?
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of Nick Saban often. Like, I can't pinpoint one season where he said it, but he kind of gets exasperated with the reporters in front of him, and I think the media in general, and he just says, well, why do we bother to play the games at all? If we know the outcome, if we really know what the outcome is going to be, then why do we bother playing? What's the point of competition?
Sure.
And I think Alabama fans, we can certainly get ahead of ourselves in thinking, well, this will be a cakewalk. They'll steamroll over this team. I mean, look back at 2020. That team steamrolled over everybody except for Ole Miss. You remember that Ole Miss game, everybody? And that's one we keep coming back to. But who expected that when it was happening in the moment? I mean, Alabama scored at will. Ole Miss couldn't do anything to stop Alabama, but the same was true on the other side of the ball. Nobody anticipated that. So you have those games where something weird happens, and Ole Miss has been that team for Alabama the last decade, so they very well could be this year. We'll get into it, but can't get too far ahead of yourselves. There's always one or two of those games that is going to worry you at the onset, and a couple of those games that are going to actually just punch you in the mouth when they're happening.
And in the meantime, we want to hear from you guys. We're going to go through the schedule and tell you what we think, but we want to know what you guys feel as fans and what you're worrying about too. And we're going to throw your comments up on the screen. Jerry Black is already weighing in. He says, I worry about every game. I remember Louisiana Monroe. And I think that is what Nick Saban would like everyone to think and feel, Jerry, is that he wants everybody to remember Louisiana Monroe. He wants everybody to take every game seriously. And actually, Anthony here has a similar, I think, conditioning from Coach Saban. Says, I've never been a fan of the cupcake games. And that does worry some people, Ben. You always hear people say, I worry we're not going to take these guys seriously enough. And, I would say this. Mercer hasn't been playing football very long. New Mexico State has not been decent in a very, very long time. But we've talked about Southern Miss before on this show.
Yeah, and if we want to talk about the quote-unquote cupcake games early here, in terms of like the worry factor, I think there is concern in those games. I think that if the game is competitive, I think that can be good for Alabama. Like you go back to that Georgia Southern game in 2011, everybody remembers the triple option team that just ran right through one of the greatest defenses of all time, not just in Alabama history, but of all time, just ran right through them. I won't use the term that Nick Saban used to describe the way that went. But I think that if the game is competitive, that can be good for Alabama as it relates to what they'll see down the road and sort of like re-energizing them, giving them a good kick in the behind and light a fire under them to say, okay, now it's time to get serious. And that's just sort of like a very general big picture look at it. In terms of the cupcake games, that worries me is injuries, Matt, because Mercer hasn't been playing – they haven't been playing football long, but when they're in Tuscaloosa and Bryant-Denny Stadium, they're still playing football. They're still making tackles. Alabama players are still making cuts on that turf that could result in catastrophic injury. And so, like with those games, the way I look at them is, I hope everybody comes out healthy by the end of
Yeah,
it. That should be the result.
Whether you win those games or not, they can have catastrophic effects on your season. And I maybe a topic for the future. I mean, it would be a grim one to go into, but there are a lot of those games that we would call cupcake games where stuff happened in the game that may have cost Alabama a national championship.
I mean, going back before the Saban era, right before it, who remembers Brody Croyle when he tore his ACL against Western Carolina when he was running out of bounds. So, and it's happened during the Saban era too. So these things happen, and it's like no disrespect to those teams because they're coming to play and they're going to try to give Alabama their best shot. And in some cases, they give Alabama more trouble than they expected, like the Georgia Southerns and other teams that have come through town. So those games are not just nothing cupcake games. Major things can happen. Major storylines can develop as a result of them.
Well, let's get into the schedule, Ben. I'm not going to leave it up the whole time, but we'll kind of pop it up and bring it back down again. And we're going to kind of go through this chronologically here and just tell you what we think it is worth worrying about or questioning whether it's something that fans will be worrying about. And obviously, I think the first one that people are going to bring up is that Miami game in the season opener against Atlanta. There's apparently already some trash talk coming from Miami about this game. I saw Rob here said, is the hype about Miami legitimate, or is this another case of the fan base being overconfident? And I'll say this about Miami, Ben. I think there are some of these teams that, have a tendency to come into that season opener with Alabama with a little bit of hesitancy, humility. I mean, I think most fans aren't humble in week one because you want to be excited about the season and you want to believe this is the year and something special is about to happen. But I think you look at some of these past season openers, and I think most fans go into it with a pretty reasonable expectation of how they're going to look against Alabama. Miami, though, despite the fact that they still have, I believe, not made it to the ACC championship game ever since they've been in that league. You can't get rid of the confidence. You can't get rid of the cockiness from the Miami fan base. It's just kind of baked into their identity now. And I think it's going to be a noisy morning in Atlanta heading into that game. I think there's going to be some big time chirping.
Miami's back, Matt. I'm convinced this is the game that I've had circled on my calendar for a long time now. I expect Miami to dominate all facets of the game. I think they'll probably have multiple Heisman candidates, and we're looking at the early 2000s Miami again, like Butch Davis, Larry Coker, Clinton Portis, Willis McGahee, Jeremy Shockey. You can go up and down the line. It's about time. We've been clamoring for it for a while now, several years where it's looked to be the case, and it didn't quite work out the way that people might have hoped it to work out. But I think this is the year, and I think they are going to make a statement in Atlanta. And it's not been just this season. Like ever since they scheduled Miami, I knew that this was probably going to happen. So prepared for it, but hopefully Alabama can regroup after that game because the season won't be over, and Alabama has survived seasons where they've had one loss. So the big picture is more important, and so you get past that game, and then you just have to win out and then hope for the best. But yeah, I mean, look, a train is coming.
Ben's for people who maybe are not regular viewers here and don't know Ben very well, tongue could not be further in cheek on that statement for Ben. I think Ben, you made a valiant effort to sell me on that. I'm not buying it. I don't think you're worried about Miami.
I don't know. I just, it's Miami's back year after year after year after year for the first half of the season when they go 4-0. And I think this really is the one.
So really do you really think Miami's a threat here?
Look, Matt, it's not like I've watched the past 14 years of Alabama stomping non-conference teams in these neutral site games the way that they have. You would think that I would have learned a lesson by now in terms of the pattern that has developed there.
Yeah.
But I think this one's different. I think this one's different because Miami is finally back. And there will be a Sports Illustrated cover to confirm that. And everybody will be on the same page. And that's basically how the season will play out.
I think that everyone would love to. There are a lot of people who would love for that to be the case, especially ESPN. I think anybody who's trying to hype this game up. I would say I'm always a guy who's pretty hesitant. let me throw this up real quick. Yeah, they're not buying it either, Ben. So the I would say going into national championship game, going into playoff games, even when I think Alabama is clearly the superior team, I've seen enough stuff in my time to know you should never speak confidently about the outcome of a football game. Almost never, because stuff can happen and people can be shocked, and teams with really good talent can have a great game plan one day and just have your number. We've seen it happen to Alabama in the playoffs before. We've seen Clemson do it to Alabama. Just absolutely take it to Alabama. We've seen Ohio, and frankly, a not super great Ohio State team back in 2014 did it to Alabama. I would say that the closest thing to a certainty in college football is Nick Saban having his team beyond ready for a season opener at a neutral site. They have never once looked like they were in trouble in one of these games before. I want to say maybe they had a slightly sloppy start against Florida State a few years ago in Atlanta. I mean, they overcame it at halftime. They usually do. I just think from players we've talked to in the past, it seems like they're almost too prepared for these games. They almost, sometimes they even have a little bit of a stumble after those season openers because they spent so much time and effort getting ready for that season opener.
When's the last time Alabama played Miami, Matt?
I believe that was 1992, Ben.
So
or January of 93, maybe.
So this is a revenge game that's almost 30 years in the making here. So Miami probably remembers this team, and I think that they're playing with that chip on their shoulder, and even though it's in Atlanta and not New Orleans, I think that they're thinking about that game, and they plan on exacting revenge, and that's the narrative that everybody's going to be talking about going into this game.
Some of these guys are young enough that their dads could have played in that game. Might have, for all I know. I haven't researched the roster, but yeah.
Yeah.
So
big one.
So look, beyond Miami, let's look at the rest of September, and really the one that jumps out at you is that game at Florida, which honestly, Ben, Florida, we talked about Ole Miss gave Alabama a hard time last year. Florida arguably was the second toughest out for Alabama on that 2020 schedule.
Yeah, that was a great game. But it was similar to the Ole Miss game where it never, to be honest with you, man, I think the Ole Miss game felt more in doubt than the Florida game did. Like at that point,
I think so too. Yeah.
At that point, we knew who Alabama was, right? Like we knew what that offense could do and that they could basically score anytime they wanted to. And I just never felt like Florida could fully keep up in the same way that that Ole Miss did after the show. But no, look, Kyle Trask is gone. So they had this quarterback that they loved, that they believed in, a guy who was he was a Heisman finalist in the end, correct,
Yes,
Matt?
he was,
Yeah, top 4 guy in the Heisman race. So great quarterback, no longer there, so they're going to have to rebuild at that position. Some programs are better at it than others. Maybe Dan Mullen is one of those guys who can shape somebody up with so quick a turnaround, the way that Lincoln Riley has been able to at Oklahoma, the way Alabama has been able to over the past several years. So we'll see what Florida can do. But, I suspect that Alabama is just going to be more talented across the board than Florida. But the Swamp it's look, it's a great environment as opposed to last year. The place is going to be packed. At least that's the plan for college football this year. So I look forward to seeing an intimidating environment and seeing how young quarterback Bryce Young and the rest of that offense performs when everybody's screaming at them, as opposed to last year when there was limited capacity in all of these road stadiums. So it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, and Florida does have a really talented quarterback, a guy named Emory Jones, who's
Yes.
is a phenomenal athlete, and I think can be a really dangerous player in that offense. And we saw how good that Florida offense can be. They've been recruiting well. I would say that Dan Mullen thus far has not recruited at this. I mean, certainly not at the same level as Alabama, but there's not many programs that do. I would say he's kind of in this second tier in terms of recruiting in the SEC, where not quite keeping up with the Georgia, Alabama, LSU level of recruiting. Still very good, though, and clearly has an offense that can be dangerous to anybody, can be dangerous to Alabama, certainly. So I'm curious to see. I think Alabama's kind of fortunate to get them relatively early in the season here and untested.
Matt, do you think that last year's Florida season is Dan Mullen's ceiling as Florida's coach? Do you think that they can have a better season than they did last year?
It's really tough to for most programs, and again, we kind of have to re-educate Alabama fans on what normal college football experience is like. Most programs have to build, and things have to all hit at the right time for you to make a championship run, and they don't come along every year. And I think that Florida had what it took. I think if Florida wins that SEC title game, that they could have gone through the playoffs and won it all. I definitely think they were good enough to do that. They were not great on defense by any stretch, but their offense, just like Alabama's, they were pretty much unstoppable on offense by the end of the season. So it's tough to just bring that back the next year when you lose a first round NFL tight end, when you lose great wide receivers, and you lose a really, really good quarterback who very clearly just was, again, similarly to Mac Jones, the offense and him had become one. They were speaking the same language, and you can't just get that right away from day one, even with a really talented young quarterback like Emory Jones. So I think it would be tough to just step right back into it this year, and I think that they will. Could they build back to another championship run? They could, but for most programs, when you have a team that good, it's because everything hit right for you at the same time. And honestly, they still kind of screwed it up even beyond just not beating Alabama. I mean, that in a normal season, that loss to LSU, that really dumb, inexcusable loss to LSU would have ended it for most teams, I think.
Yeah, you mentioned recruiting. Like, it's always tricky position by position, but I do wonder how Dan Mullen did in terms of replacing somebody to throw the shoe as best they could in a crucial game that may or may not keep you in the college football playoff hunt. So, yeah, there you go. We have a comment there that references that. That was just unbelievable. Like, how long were we removed from the invisible fire hydrant in the end zone in the Egg Bowl game? And I just thought that would live in infamy forever. And then like a season later, the shoe throw happens. Unbelievable, man. The SEC, where it just means more. You can never run out of moments like that. Just unbelievable.
Yep. Very, very fun stuff. So look, Ole Miss rings in October for Alabama. I think it's at home this year. I think Alabama's fortunate for that, but Ole Miss brings back a lot of those guys that they had in that offense last year. They're gonna be good again, and honestly, it's genuinely not even a talent-driven offense. They have talented players on that offense, but I don't think Ole Miss was as good as they were offensively just because they had better talent than everybody else. I think that we know from having watched him at Alabama that Lane Kiffin transforms how an offense operates. And he has, in addition to just being a very clever play caller who can dissect an opponent's defense, I think he's very clearly good at coaching an offense into playing with a level of precision and with a level of togetherness that makes it work really well and really consistently.
They were stealing signs last year, Matt. That's why it was so close.
About that.
Look, I mean, why else would they be a step ahead of Alabama's defense that way? I mean, it makes no sense. That I think Tuscaloosa is going to be rocking that whole week leading up to that game. Like, that's going to be the game. Like, it won't surprise me if that's the CBS game or a primetime game, whatever. Like, that's going to be one that, like, I think the nation is going to be watching, just based on what happened last year, based on the fact that Matt Corral is considered one of the best quarterbacks in the nation, if not the best quarterback in the nation. It's like him, Spencer Rattler, and a handful of other guys who people consider like the elite quarterbacks. So, we talked in the past about how Alabama does with elite quarterbacks. It can be a major struggle, and they can give, they would give anybody problems. But Alabama, if you can beat Alabama, obviously that puts you in a different conversation. So that, and the whole narrative of Lane Kiffin coming to town, this streak that Saban has against his assistants, at some point that's going to get snapped. If it never does, it'll be one of the great streaks of all time. But Lane Kiffin obviously wants to beat Alabama. He wants to beat Nick Saban. He's going to come in with an incredible game plan. So Alabama needs to be ready. They need to mentally prepare themselves for this game. But, Alabama also has the chip on their shoulder of, we went down there last year. They gave us everything that we could handle. We don't want that to happen again. So maybe Alabama has a better plan. Maybe they'll protect those signals that Lane Kiffin stole in the game, and the defense will execute a little bit better. But that's one for sure that everybody should have circled on their calendars. That one, like I said, the Tuscaloosa is just going to be rocking and rolling. Yeah,
that's a good point, Ben, that I think it's probably easier for Saban to sell his defense on hey, you guys aren't good enough for these guys yet. You're not ready. You got to put in more work. I mean, there's nothing could motivate a group of guys better than saying, you almost lost this for us last year. As good as our offense was in that game, we scored 70+ points and we still almost lost because you guys couldn't get a stop. I think they're going to be hearing it that week.
Yeah, well, man, if you want to talk about a rough night on Alabama fan Twitter, like, go back if you can somehow and go look at the tweets that night. Like, as that game was happening in real time, like, Alabama fans can be hard on their team. Like, they love their team, but when they don't like the defense, they don't like the performance, they do not waste a second to express those feelings. And that night, just the comments about the defense, it was troubling, Matt. Troubling would be the word that I would use.
I think it took the fan base basically almost the entire rest of the season to regain confidence that their team could actually win a national title. And we were still, even when Alabama was starting to basically shut teams out later in the year, you're still hearing people say the defense isn't good enough. They're not going to get it done.
Look, Ole Miss did almost anything they wanted in that game.
Yeah.
Like, they did. They just did. Like, they executed beautifully. They ran their offense so well. Thankfully, Alabama ran theirs even better than they did. But it was scary, man. Like, I don't think people give this game the respect that it probably deserves. That game was scary. They had Alabama on the ropes, and it took Alabama literally gaining almost every single yard that they could gain in that game to win it. So hopefully we don't see a repeat performance from Ole Miss, but I have a feeling that they are going to come prepared.
Could be a tough one. So really, you look at October. It's not a cakewalk by any stretch. I mean, you go right out of that Ole Miss game 1 week later on the road to Texas A&M, and a lot of people have good feelings about Texas A&M going to this season, including Jimbo. We know that he's been quoted out there as saying that he's gonna finally get Saban this year. You've got a road game the week after that at Mississippi State, and I've seen some folks having some confidence in Mississippi State too this season. Tennessee, I'm not going to try to sell anybody on that one. I mean, that program is in an absolute mess, and it's going to, even if Josh Heupel turns it around there. It ain't going to be this year. It's going to take them a long time and a lot of work. So, you know, I would say maybe individually hard for me to hype people up on Alabama struggling with Texas A&M, who they really haven't since Jimbo got there. But in the context, right, when you look at you've got this home game against Ole Miss where emotions will be high. You're coming right off of that and have this 3-week stretch of conference opponents that they're all gunning for you. Right now, they all think they're going to have a good year and that this is a special season for them potentially. That's where it gets tough in this league. Is there are very few breaks once you really get into the conference schedule, and you know things can start to add up over time. Maybe not. Maybe on paper when we're looking at the schedule right now, none of those games look scary, but I do wonder in a stretch like that, and that's probably the toughest stretch of games because really all the rest of it, you get the bye week going into LSU. Auburn's there at the end of the season, but there's some nice lead up and build up to that middle chunk of October. That's about as tough as it gets, I think, this season for Alabama.
Yeah, that's tough, especially going from Ole Miss to College Station, right? Like that's tough. That's a tall order for sure, especially early in the season. So it's going to be a major challenge for Alabama. Texas A&M is probably right there with Ole Miss in terms of the teams that Alabama fans should be most worried about. I think just like on paper, based on what happened last year, based on like what kind of recruiting Jimbo Fisher has obviously done. He's a great coach. Everybody knows what kind of coach he is. He's a national championship winning coach. And but you do have bulletin board material. And I think like we never really know like how much that actually factors in and translates to like on-field play unless players say after the fact, we talked about that all season. It was a storyline for us. It mattered. It pumped us up. So we'll see. It's like you said, it's probably best to just not say anything going into a season, let alone one where you're playing Alabama and you're making comments.
The other guys. I mean, I would say that's genuinely, you can't lose. If you do nothing but talk about how good your opponent is, you cannot. There's no downside to doing that.
That's the Saban special, though.
Yep.
Like that's his MO is basically just to butter up the team and talk about how talented they are, how good a coach they have, the success. Like even if they go, 4-9 the previous season, he'll talk about the 4 games that they won and how much improvement they showed throughout the season. Like that's what he does. So sure. Yeah, I mean, he obviously knows how to play that political game in terms of not giving the other side much bulletin board material. So, but we'll see. Jimbo's a different personality than Nick Saban, and so I think people are anxious to see what kind of improvements Texas A&M has made under him, especially with like how much money he's making, the size of that contract, and the expectations that he has. So people are going to be looked for like major improvements from Texas A&M. Now, when you lose a quarterback like Kellen Mond, it's going to be difficult to turn something around into something that's better than it was the year before or even the season before with Mond at quarterback, guy who's very talented, who gave Alabama some trouble under center. But they have this new quarterback. His name is Haynes King, I believe, who's a tall guy, dual threat guy. So maybe there will be no drop off whatsoever. Maybe there will be some improvement. Maybe it's more of a Jimbo Fisher type quarterback that will have a lot of success. So who knows? But it's always tricky going to Texas A&M. Alabama has had some success there in the past, certainly, but it's always one that can be competitive.
Lots of comments rolling in on this topic today. One from Robin says, we're playing all 3 Mississippi teams. I live in Mississippi. I'm going to take a ton of flack. Well, Robin, for your sake, I hope we're all able to utter the refrain at the end of the season of "Thank God for Mississippi," one of the most popular prayers to say in the state of Alabama. But it could be rough. We've seen it in the past. The Mississippi teams can sneak up on us. I'll say this, and I brushed off Auburn earlier because we were talking about this stretch of games in October. LSU is what it is. I think we all know that's going to be a big game every year, whether LSU is up to it or not. It's in Tuscaloosa this year. LSU is coming off a bad beatdown. I think they've got something to prove. I think we all know that'll be a big game that people
was it a big game last year?
I mean, there was some hype from LSU. I don't think any Alabama fans were worried about it at all. But look, that team, they recruit extremely well every year. Last season was a very weird year for LSU. They had a ton of guys sitting out. Probably hit as hard by all of those external things going on. COVID, guys sitting out or missing time because of COVID, probably hit LSU harder than any other program in the country. So I would say, I'm not saying I think they're going to be better than Alabama, but I think it's going to be a more competitive game than it was last year. But one thing I do want to ask the commenters, and I'll give this a few minutes to roll in while me and you talk about LSU, Ben. How are you guys feeling about Auburn right now? I think Alabama fans knew how to feel about Auburn under Gus, which is, I would say, if I'm being fair here, please tell me. I think Alabama fans looked at Auburn under Malzahn as, we're better than them, but they've always got something for us. And I think Alabama fans were always a little nervous about the Iron Bowl, no matter what happened that season, because Gus took that game incredibly seriously. It was his Super Bowl, and he had stuff ready for Alabama every year. He pulled out tricks nobody even knew were tricks in that game, and it did have an impact. I mean, I would say that Auburn won more than they should have, just based on team quality and recruiting and talent and all that. Under Malzahn. So now we don't have that anymore. Now it's a new regime. How do people feel about Auburn? How do people feel about the Iron Bowl now going into this season? I mean, it's a lot of the same players. The Auburn really didn't lose very much to the draft. That they bring back the same quarterback. They bring back a lot of the same talent. What do you guys think about Auburn? Do they still make you as nervous as maybe they did under Malzahn? So we'll let that roll in. But Ben, do you have any thoughts on LSU or Auburn?
Not really on LSU. I think Alabama, I think that they're still on a different level than LSU going into the season. Maybe I'm wrong, because like you said, and like this commenter Sean Hobson just said, LSU gets great recruits, and regardless of what Coach Orgeron does with them, like, talent does eventually show up on the field, and it often has in these games between Alabama and LSU. When you think Alabama has the better team, it's more competitive than maybe you expect it to be because of the level of talent that's on LSU's side of the field too. So you never really know. I don't know. I'm not going to sit here and say Alabama's going to steamroll them or anything. I'm certainly not prepared to do that. But with Auburn, I still think, Matt, and listen, you know that fan base better than I do. But maybe they were ready to move on from Gus Malzahn. But I think nobody breathed a bigger sigh of relief when Auburn fired Gus Malzahn than Nick Saban. Because to me, how much better can you get than what Gus Malzahn did at Auburn in terms of him being arguably, other than Dabo Swinney, Hugh Freeze, but him being arguably the best coach in college football at beating Nick Saban, which is very hard to do. He did it several times, sometimes in unbelievable fashion, but he gave Saban's teams fits, man. And like you said, Alabama fans dreaded that game because I think of Gus Malzahn and his game planning and his offensive scheming, and I just think he was a headache for them. But, I mean, you're talking about a guy who won an SEC championship or one or two. I can't remember.
They won one title. They made it to the SEC championship in 2017 and did not
lost
win
to
the
Georgia.
game.
That's right.
Yeah.
And after they beat Alabama and made it to the national championship, had been in the college football playoff conversation several times under Gus Malzahn. Like, depending on whether they beat Alabama, had they won that SEC championship against Georgia, are they in the college football playoff? Probably, yes, absolutely. So Auburn was in a good place. Like, there would be those years, obviously, where Alabama would blow them out, and they would certainly disappoint. But look, I'm not an Auburn fan, so I can't speak for them. But it just seems like, to me, Gus Malzahn gave them some of the greatest memories they'll ever have, right?
I can't imagine it'll get much better than 2013.
Exactly. Yeah. And there were some good times after that, too. And again, he was good at beating Nick Saban. If it didn't happen every year, it happened more often than other coaches can beat him when the stakes couldn't be higher. So anyway, my point being that I think that Saban and Alabama fans are probably glad he's gone, and probably look forward to this Iron Bowl. And it probably won't be this year that Auburn is competitive with Alabama, but who knows? Maybe like those low expectations for them will catch people off guard, and maybe they'll be better than they think. Maybe the Iron Bowl will be the Super Bowl to Brian Harsin too. So it all remains to be seen. And look, Matt, like, to be fair, there's still so many unanswered questions about Alabama. And so we're predicting and talking about all these things without really knowing what kind of quarterback Bryce Young is, right?
Yeah,
like we've seen him play, but we don't have all the answers there. Like going into the season, like going into 2019, obviously we knew in 2018 and 2019, we knew who Tua Tagovailoa was. We had seen him do it, right? Under with the highest possible stakes, like the most important football, he stepped up, he played great. We have not seen Bryce Young do that, so we don't really know what kind of team Alabama is going to have this year, even though they do have some guys returning from that national championship squad that was dominant. Still a lot of unanswered questions.
I think that's totally fair to say. I do want to point out, Walt made a good point here, just talking about how sometimes a new coach can kind of add this new energy into a program. I think that's certainly what Auburn was hoping for under Gus. That can be a short-lived thing. You ultimately you have to have some success early, or whatever buy-in you get from your players is going to go away pretty quickly. So I do think Harsin at Auburn is going to be looking to make a big splash either this year or next year. You got to do something big that makes people believe in you. And there's no better opportunity than Alabama. And another good comment here from Adam Garcia, which we didn't talk about because it's not technically on the schedule. Alabama dodges Georgia in the regular season this year. But Georgia getting a ton of hype. I think a lot of people are saying this is Georgia's big chance. This is if they're ever going to do it, this is their year. And most likely, if Alabama's able to get through their schedule unscathed, Georgia's going to be waiting for them in Atlanta. So that's something you got to keep in the back of your mind, even though it's not on the schedule.
Matt, it's going to be the first ever triple threat national championship match where it's going to be Georgia versus Miami versus Notre Dame. And one of those teams is finally going to win the national championship because it's their year. It's all three of those teams' year this year, Matt. All three of them. So all three of them are going to make the national championship game. But I do have a question for you, Matt.
Yeah.
You do a similar show for our counterparts over there in Auburn, correct?
I do, yeah.
And they've done a schedule a look ahead to the 2021 schedule.
We did.
And
they did.
So I think that our viewers here might be interested to know, what did Auburn's folks say about Alabama? We've talked about what Alabama thinks about Auburn, but what did they say about Alabama? How worried are they about this Alabama game?
So first of all, if you're not aware, if you want to get a nice little peek into the minds of your Auburn friends and how they're thinking, I would encourage everybody to go over to our Auburn pages on YouTube and Facebook. And search for Tiger Takes is what it's called over there. It's their version of what we do here on Bammers, and it's hosted by Lyndon Blake and Allie Davison, who are two very smart, experienced reporters who also went to Auburn and are Auburn fans. And like I said, we did this topic over there, and I'm not on camera for that show, so I didn't speak, but I produced that show, and they had the Iron Bowl as their number 5 game that they were most worried about. So now I don't know what that means. I don't want to speak for Allie and Lyndon, but I would say they say they're not wringing their hands about the Iron Bowl right now. There's other games that they're much more worried about right now. And maybe it's just because they kind of would consider a win in the Iron Bowl this year to be, a cherry on top, like house money, right? Like nobody's expecting them to do it this year. So there's not a ton of pressure.
So they're talking bowl eligibility, right? And so like Alabama does not factor into the bowl eligibility conversation. So they are worried about the Mercers. They are worried about the Mississippi States.
I think they're look, Auburn has a tough schedule this year. They've got a road game at Penn State.
Right.
So tough. they don't I wouldn't say that I don't think they're going to make a bowl game, but I think that Auburn is probably the 7 to 8 win line is probably more where they're concerning themselves right now.
Okay. So
we got one comment here from Chris who says, I might get a virus on my computer if I go there to the Auburn show. So I look, not every Alabama fan wants to go into that world, but I will say sometimes it can be fun to hear what the other side is saying. So
yeah, to do recon.
No one will know if you're watching, I promise.
Well, I just thought their perspective mattered, and we needed to understand how they felt on the other side. So makes all the sense in the world, though, Matt.
Look, I like I said, I'm there, I'm listening. But I don't weigh in. So they're welcome to speak their minds as Auburn fans. It is fascinating sometimes to hear the difference in how they see things and how they approach their season too. Again, these are very different fan bases, and that's one of the things that you get to know over time. I mean, I grew up mostly knowing Alabama fans, and so I know I have a pretty good idea of how you guys think and what you worry about. But Auburn fans think about things differently. They worry about things differently, and it can be interesting to get a different perspective on it.
Well, it's a credit to them that we're even talking about them right now. So I'm just saying, if we're spending time talking about Auburn and how they feel about Alabama, then that means Auburn's on Alabama's minds too.
I think they would love to know that. I think they would say something like rent free.
Right, exactly. Proudly.
Yeah. Well, good discussion today about the schedule. Tons of comments. So you guys clearly have a lot to say about this topic. So keep the discussion going in the comment section here on YouTube and Facebook. And we'll be back again next Thursday to talk about another topic. We'll if you guys have any suggestions, by the way, if you have something that you'd like us to talk about on Bammers in a future show, drop those in there. We always appreciate those too. So, as Walt says, Auburn and Alabama have to get through the rest of the SEC schedule before they worry about each other. That's what they do the whole rest of the offseason is worry about each other. But once September rolls around, there's more pressing matters to think about.
And Clemson plays Georgia this year, right? Or
in the season opener, yeah.
Wow, that's awesome.
Neutral site game. So that'll be a fun one to watch. I mean, that opening, we'll talk about that, I think, as we get closer to the season. But this is an all-timer opening weekend in college football. There's going to be so many fun games going on as we all wait to get ready for that Alabama-Miami game, which I believe is a afternoon kickoff, Ben. Am I right about that?
Sounds right.
I think that's what it is.
Just Alabama fans, just mentally prepare yourselves to start your season 0-1 for the first time of the Saban era, I believe, right? Like I can't remember the first
definitely
time.
Never happened before.
Yeah,
He's never lost an opener.
So just be ready, and then the season starts the next week.
That's right. All right. Well, if Ben continues to hold a straight face, always impressive. Thank you for joining us, Ben. And thanks to all of the commenters today who you guys were incredibly active on the show, as you always are. We love it. And we will see you guys next week on another episode of Bammers.